I'm Ann Bocock, and welcome to Between the Covers. The book Hidden Tapestry is a true story, and I'm saying this because it's such an extraordinary biography that at times it's hard to believe it really happened. It's the story of a boy who ran away with the Gypsies when he was 12, the young man who fought in the resistance in World War II, who was later captured by the Nazis and tortured. The same man who married his childhood sweetheart, yet led a polygamous life with her and her best childhood friend. The trio living the Bohemian life of artists in Greenwich Village in the 1950s. Debra Dean is the best-selling author of 2 novels and a short story collection. Her books have been published in 21 languages. Please welcome Debra Dean, the author of Hidden Tapestry, Jan Yours, His 2 Wives, and the War That Made Them One.
Thank you.
I am so glad to talk to you about this book. And for me, it was a bonus in the fact that I didn't know anything about him. I don't know if I'm alone in this, but it made the story that much more interesting. I didn't know where it was going to go. I'd like to start at the beginning, if we could. It's summer. It's in Belgium. Jan is 11 years old, I believe.
11 or 12.
11 or 12, and he meets Barrett at a summer camp.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The 2 of them met for a week. And Burt, this was going to sound like a crazy thing to say about a 7-year-old. She was 7, he was 11 or 12. She fell madly in love with him. And at the end of the week, when camp was over and she had to leave, she was just heartbroken. And he said, I'm going to come back someday when we're both grown up and I'm going to marry you.
This to me is such an insight into what I think is this charismatic personality of this man. You think it started in his childhood?
Oh yeah, absolutely. His mother tells a story about him when he was just 2 or 3 years old, deciding that he was going to go off on an adventure and walking out the front door. And they were aware that he was going, and when they were watching, and he got kind of to the end, it was a quiet little cul-de-sac, got about halfway down the block, and then turned around and came back and knocked on the door. And they answered the door, and he said, I'm still too young. But he just, there was something about him that was special, and his parents recognized that from when he was very small.
He professes his love for this 7-year-old. He's going to come back and marry her someday. They kept up an interesting pen pal-ish relationship for a decade.
Yeah, yeah. They wrote letters, and the family still has the letters. I was able to go and look at these letters from the 1930s and 40s, and they have hand drawings on them. And he was lying all through the letters, and
If you read the book, he's going to lie a lot.
He lies a lot, yeah. But he was doing these things that he couldn't tell her about. He had run away with those Romas.
Now, can we talk about this?
Yeah.
He's 12 years old.
Yeah.
This is where it sounds so fantastic. He runs away with the Gypsies.
Yeah.
Number one, how does that happen? And number 2, the Gypsies are a very closed-knit society.
Right.
It's very tight. Why did they accept him?
He was a child, and he was charming. An older person would not have been able to get into that society, but he befriended a couple of the boys, and they just kind of let him in. And he was very good at working himself into closed societies. Later on in his life in New York, he became friends with people in Chinatown and Harlem. He had friends in Brooklyn, in closed Jewish communities. He was just very good at working himself into places where he didn't belong.
When he was this young kid and he's with the Gypsies, where were they going? What was that kind of a life like?
They were traveling around Europe. And Jan tells the story. He wrote a memoir, 2 actually, one called The Gypsies and a second one called Crossing. And the first one was just about his travels with the Gypsies. And the memoir is, for a biographer, extraordinarily frustrating because there's no dates, there's no place names. It's just, the life of being without borders and without time, which is was part of the Roma culture. Dates and places weren't important.
I have to say that I learned things about the Gypsies that I didn't know. I think I had a very distorted
Most people do.
impression.
Yeah.
And they had a very interesting code, or have a very interesting code of how to live.
Yeah, yeah. Because it's like, how do you live in a culture where there's no privacy? And so they're very careful about their manners, and young men and young women, there was very strict adherence to, you didn't even talk to a young person of the opposite sex unless someone else was around. And you didn't say you had to go to the bathroom, nobody ever appeared to do that because it would be impolite. So there was just a whole code. It's actually called marame, and it's just a way of getting along.
We talk about him running away with the Gypsies, and anybody who's reading this, their first thought is, whose parents are going to let them do this?
Right.
But he did not grow up in what you would call a traditional upbringing. I'm very impressed with his mother, Magda. Tell me about how they raised him.
Well, they were Bohemians, and the original Bohemians. They were one of the first peoples to practice macrobiotics. And he was an artist. The father, Eugene Yours, was an artist. His mother was, she had a radio show, and she was speaking out against Hitler all through the 30s. And they had this idea about Jan, like, yes, he's young, yes, he's our son, but he's an autonomous human being. And so when he ran off with the Gypsies, he came back 6 months later. And they were very cool about it. They were saying, well, we'd like you to grow up and become an artist like your father, but if you want to be a vagabond, we'll support that. I mean, it's just crazy.
There was a quote from one of the neighbors who said that the Yours were, I think, communist, anarchist, and vegetarians.
Right.
So I loved that.
Yeah, none of that was true except for the vegetarian part. But yeah, and it was one of those things that was a real stumbling block for me when I was researching it. I thought, how is this possible? Now, over the course of researching, I was working with the family archives, which Corey, the son, is still compiling these things. And so he was finding things, and I was finding things as we were researching that changed the story. And one of the things I found was just a couple lines from Anna Burt's diaries from written years later, and she makes a reference to Jan having been molested by a priest when he was young. And I thought, okay. And that was the impetus for running away. It's not a story he ever told. He had a very romanticized story about running away from the Gypsies.
But reading the book, that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
Here it is, it's World War II. He finds himself fighting with the resistance. First of all, I don't know how that happens. And then he is captured. Mm-hmm.
Well, his mother, because she was involved with all this, with social reform, and her friends were, Jan's never been quite clear about how it happened either, but it seemed, when I was researching, it seemed pretty clear that one of his mother's friends, Betsy, who was like a surrogate aunt, probably was the one that got him into the resistance. And he was just approached one day by an MI6 agent. And they really wanted, not so much him, but they wanted him to recruit the Romas, the Gypsies, into the resistance, because they had all the skills that you need to be in the underground.
And he had fake passports and different names, just
and
incredible.
They were used to moving across borders and going places where, being unseen when they didn't want to be seen.
But here he is, the son of pacifists, and he's blowing up bridges?
Yeah. They started out just doing, hiding people and robbing ration coupon centers to get coupons for the resistance. But then they moved into saboteur work, and they were blowing up trains and bridges. And in that work, he was captured by the Nazis, 2 times that we have documentation for, probably 3.
That whole section in the book just showed me what a complicated man he is. We get to the point where he's captured. He was tortured, correct?
Yeah. He was, the last time he was arrested, he was put into solitary confinement. He was tortured repeatedly, and he was sentenced to death. And he was 20 years old. And he was in solitary confinement for 6 months. And then through another one of these weird stories, one day, he'd been sentenced to death. So one day the guards show up early in the morning, which is when they would get people when they were going to execute them. And he thought, okay, this is it, time's up. And they took him to an office and they handed him another man's passport and another man's personal effects, and they had him sign some papers. And then they just opened the door and released him. And he never knew why. He thought, well, okay, either it's a bureaucratic error, but the Germans weren't really known for their bureaucratic errors. and you know, or it was orchestrated by the resistance, or they knew what they were doing and they were just hoping that maybe he would lead them to other members of his cell.
He's 20 years old. He's already lived, I don't know how many lifetimes
Yeah.
by this point. He is released. He gets out. And because the story can't get any crazier, he goes back to find Annabert, who he hasn't seen since, what, 7 years old?
Yeah, at the end of the war.
I mean, who wouldn't do that? Okay.
You know, they'd been staying in touch, and of course she had no idea that he was in the resistance. She had no idea he'd traveled with the Gypsies. She thought he was an art student in Belgium. She may have wondered why the letters took so very, very long to go back and forth. But yeah, he went back and he found her and he married her, just like he said he would. But you know, the being tortured had taken a toll. He really had what we would recognize now as PTSD. And so he was very damaged. And Annabert was a new bride, and she didn't know what to make of all of this. And he decided to take up his father's vocation as an artist. And he did life studies, and so he needed a model. They couldn't afford one. And so she said, well, you know, I think this might have been his idea. They invited her best friend from childhood to come live with them.
They were living in England at this point.
They were, yes.
And they invite Marianne, who was Annabert's best childhood friend, to live with them. This is a newly married young couple.
Right.
And she's living with them. And she becomes really the third leg of this triangle.
Yes.
So take it from there.
One of the things that when I was researching, I talked to a lot of people that knew Jan. I never got to meet him. He died in 1977. But I talked to people that knew him. And one of the things every single person said about him was how charming he was and how charismatic he was. And I have to think it must have taken every ounce of that charisma and charm to persuade these 2 best friends, these 2 childhood friends, to share him. You know, they started out the usual way. You know, he had an affair with his model. People do that all the time. But what was different was neither he nor Marion wanted to betray Annabert. He didn't want to have any secrets anymore. And so he went to Annabert and proposed this, that they should the 3 of them should form this union that they called a threefold cord, which is from Ecclesiastes, but I don't think has probably ever been used in that context. And yeah, they had a polygamous relationship.
It was a very interesting relationship. We fast forward a little bit to 1950. Everyone moves to New York, to Greenwich Village. Actually, Jan went first, and then I think that the ladies went a year later.
Yeah.
Even in Greenwich Village in the 1950s, wouldn't you say this was a very unconventional threesome?
Well, that's why they went to Greenwich Village. You know, I mean, in 1950, if you were an artist or a bohemian or you know, you just wanted to live without the judgment of your neighbors, that's where you went. So, but even by Greenwich Village standards, they stood out.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And nobody knew that they were polygamous. He introduced Annabert as his wife, and Marion was his wife's sister. So even people that knew them for a very long time didn't know what the real relationship was.
They lived a very interesting, the ladies, almost a cloistered life. He went out and did God knows what, but they really were at home.
Yeah, they lived like gypsies, and the women were, you know, they stayed, and they were white. He designed tapestries, these huge, enormous, gorgeous tapestries, and they wove them. And it's not like they just wove on weekends. It was a full-time job. And so they were at home, and they lived a very domestic life. And he was out getting the commissions and hanging out with the artists and the museum directors and the people that would get commissions.
Their relationship fascinates me. It's not, I can't call it a 50-50 split. I can't even call it an equal third split.
No.
He had all the cards, right? Would you
Yeah.
say that
Yeah.
was the
Well,
power
and that's one of
source?
the reasons I wanted to write the book, because, like I say, he had written 2 memoirs, and he had done countless television, radio interviews, magazine interviews. They were behind the scenes, and their story had never really been told. And I thought their story, independent of his, was very interesting as well.
They really challenged the idea of a marriage. Why do you think it worked for them?
I don't know, because I think marriage with 2 people is hard enough. It worked for a really long time, though. And I think part of it is they had a mission, you know, they had a sense of purpose, that they had come out of the war. All 3 of them had been traumatized by the war.
In different ways.
In different ways. And the story, the first third of the book, toggles back and forth between their 3 stories during the war. And they'd all been traumatized by it. And so they came out of the war, and this threefold cord, the idea behind it was they were going to dedicate their lives to art and beauty, and it was like a refutation of war and social justice. And so they had, out of this kind of, at the end of a war where it's hard to have a sense of, you know, meaning, this was their way of finding meaning.
Jan, who you would think is the glue for this relationship, that's an interesting aspect. But these ladies stayed together. He died in the 70s,
Right.
and they remained living together and working after he died.
They, in a weird way, Jan was almost like a blip in their friendship, long, important blip. But they lived together for another 30 years after Jan died, and they took Marion took care of Anna Burt until she died. She died in, I think, 2010, and they had 3 children between the 2 of them, and the children are all. It's like a blended family now. They regard each other as siblings. The grandchildren had 2 sets of grandmothers.
Each woman had children.
Yes. Anna Burt had the first 2, and then Marion had a child.
Do you look at the larger story as one of survival, as one of people do what they need to do?
Yeah. The book that I'm most well known for is a novel called The Madonnas of Leningrad, and it's set in World War II, but in Leningrad. And the themes of the novel are like, what do you need to survive? And it's more than food and shelter. And in The Madonnas of Leningrad, one of the answers was art. I don't always know until I'm done with a book why I was drawn to it, but the themes are very similar in this one. It's really like, well, when things are really bad, and as bad as they can be, what do you need to survive? And for them, the answer was art as well.
It was absolutely art. Jan was a sculptor. He was a wonderful photographer. He was a filmmaker. But what comes out of this book, and I guess what we know about him, are these tapestries. And you have to explain, first of all, the scope of these things and how they were made, but the size.
They're huge. He said, okay, so tapestry is a monumental art form. It should not be, the tapestries should be big. And then he said at one point, small tapestries are placemats. He was very emphatic about that they needed to be huge. And I came to the conclusion, his father was a well-known stained glass artist. in Europe and designed stained glass windows in the churches and monasteries of Belgium. And I think the tapestries, in a way, this was following in his father's footsteps. He was doing, they kind of look like stained glass. They have these bright jewel colors.
Oh, the colors are magnificent.
Yeah, yeah, and they're about the same size as stained glass windows. And they're huge. I mean, it would take the women about a year to weave one of these, depending on the size.
And go back to the color for a moment. These were not your off-the-shelf, off-the-rack colors. These were especially formulated for him. These things took, as you said, a year maybe to work. They had to be exactly precise. The two women were working together.
Yeah, they would both sit side by side. They had a 17-foot loom, and they would sit side by side and be working on the same tapestry.
They were as important. He designed them, but these women were as important to creating this as he was.
Oh, yeah.
I know you've spent time with Marianne. Anna Barrett, I believe, had died before you started this. Much of this story is extremely personal.
Yeah.
So one, I don't quite know how you and where you got all this information. And I am sure that having her open up to you, did she tell you things maybe that she'd never told anyone else?
Yes, she did. She just celebrated her 93rd birthday. We did over 100 hours of taped interviews. When I first was interviewing her, I was flying up to New York and interviewing her face to face because we needed to
meet,
to have a relationship. But at a certain point, she called me and she would want me to come up to New York, and I said, Marianne, I can't afford to come up to New York every time you have something to tell me. You're going to have to learn how to Skype. But yeah, she had never told her story. They had talked to reporters, but it was always the official version. And she started telling me things that she'd never spoken aloud about. In World War II, she had her own story, which is just amazing. She ended up the shorthand version is she kind of spent the war dodging the Nazis. Her father went into hiding. Her mother had died. She had not talked about any of this. And she hadn't really talked about the life with Jan. And I realized at a certain point it was becoming like therapy for her.
How, the first meeting, how did that go?
You know, it went great. It was like a blind date. We had a mutual friend that was going to introduce us, but there was a snowstorm in New York and she couldn't make it downtown. So I just showed up and I knocked at the door. She still lives in Greenwich Village. The place where they live it's amazing. It's like walking into the past. It's the studio. There's a studio there with the tapestries hanging and the sculptures, and it's wonderful. She brought out tea and cookies, which is what she always does. And we hit it off just immediately.
It shows because you have information here that no one else would have gotten.
Yeah, she told me things she hadn't told her children. So when the book was being published, she said she had friends for 40 years that didn't know some of the things that were in the book. And so she said, I have some explaining to do before this comes out.
I think so.
Yeah.
I came away from reading this book that, yes, Jan is a most attractive, charismatic man. But there were things about him that I find absolutely unattractive. And I'm conflicted in my feelings about him.
Yeah.
You've lived with him, you know, writing this for all those years. How do you feel about him?
I'm conflicted about it too. But that to me is what's interesting. I'm always drawn to people that are complicated. And so he's heroic in like kind of amazing ways. And then he's a jerk. And to me, he was interesting because of that. I kind of gave him a little bit of a pass because of what he had been through, because of the PTSD. But yeah, he's complicated, and this book had a long journey to publication, and partly because he is complicated. He's not an easy, heroic figure.
You've done best-selling novels
Yeah.
in the past. You could have written this book as fiction, couldn't you?
I couldn't. You know, it's too crazy. Who would believe this as a novel, right?
You are absolutely right.
I mean, weirdly, novels have to be plausible in a way that real life doesn't. When we say that truth is stranger than fiction, that's true. And I just thought nobody would ever, this would just seem so hokey if it was written as a novel, so I had to write it as nonfiction.
Oh, we're so glad that you did. You write in the book that Jan's life was like a tightrope act working without a net, and this anything but ordinary life is beautifully drawn against the backdrop of art and war and polygamy. The book is Hidden Tapestry. Debra Dean, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for writing this story. I'm Ann Bocock. Please connect with us and join me on the next Between the Covers.